Welcome to this online course content that supports preparing to take the Maryland Roadside Tree Care Expert exam. This supplemental presentation to the study guide is intended to aid those individuals who are preparing to take the Maryland Roadside Tree Care Expert exam as required for permitting under the Maryland Roadside Tree Law. Anyone managing a tree care program for a municipal, county, or state agency must have a certification to supervise tree care work under a roadside tree permit issued by the Maryland Forest Service of the Maryland Department of Natural Resources. This presentation corresponds to the information in the online study guide. The text of the study guide, version 3.0, may be found at dnr.maryland.gov/forests. Click on the Urban and Community Forestry tab at the top of the page, and then Roadside Tree Law in the menu on the left-hand side of the web page.
Maryland Licensed Tree Expert Exam, Study Guide version 5.1, Introduction. This study guide is intended for those individuals who are preparing to take the tree expert exam as required by the Maryland Tree Expert licensing laws. Anyone seeking to practice or advertise tree care services in the state must obtain this license from the Maryland Department of Natural Resources. Without it, they may not practice or advertise tree care services in the state. To obtain a license, the applicant must possess adequate and related college education plus 1 year of experience under a current Maryland licensed tree expert, or have 3 years of experience under a licensed tree expert. Then have passed the exam and carry adequate amounts of liability and property damage insurance. Information on exam schedules may be found on the DNR website. The exam has 10 sections or domains. The questions are in multiple choice format or true and false. A passing score of 70% is required for each individual domain, as well as for the overall test. There are 140 questions, 14 in each domain. A listing of the domains, their study materials, and the pass rates may be found in the study guide.
The 10 chapters of the Roadside Tree Care Expert Study Guide are as follows. 1. Tree laws and standards. 2. Tree biology. 3. Soil and water. 4. Tree nutrition, fertilization, and mulching. 5. Tree pruning. 6. Tree problem diagnosis. 7. Tree selection, installation, and establishment. 8. Safety standards and practices. 9. Construction and trees. 10. Tree identification.
We hope you found this supplemental presentation to be helpful as you prepare for the tree expert exam. This concludes the introduction. Please proceed to Chapter 1, Tree Laws.
Welcome to this online course content that supports preparing to take the Maryland Roadside Tree Care Expert exam. This supplemental presentation to the study guide is intended to aid those individuals who are preparing to take the Maryland Roadside Tree Care Expert exam as required for permitting under the Maryland Roadside Tree Law. Anyone managing a tree care program for a municipal, county, or state agency must have a certification to supervise tree care work under a roadside tree permit issued by the Maryland Forest Service of the Maryland Department of Natural Resources. This presentation corresponds to the information in the online study guide. The text of the study guide, version 3.0, may be found at dnr.maryland.gov/forests. Click on the Urban and Community Forestry tab at the top of the page, and then Roadside Tree Law in the menu on the left-hand side of the web page. Maryland Roadside Tree Care Expert Exam, Study Guide version 3.0. Chapter 1, Tree Laws and Standards.
There are 4 Maryland tree laws that the licensed tree expert may encounter. These include Tree Expert Law and Regulations, Roadside Tree Law and Regulations, Reforestation Law, and Forest Conservation Act and Regulations. The Maryland Tree Expert Law was adopted in 1945, with regulations passed in 2003. This provides for a statewide law addressing tree care work done for compensation on private or public property in Maryland. The purpose is to provide a layer of consumer protection by licensing qualified and insured tree care companies and individuals. All tree care professionals practicing in Maryland must obtain this tree expert license. This license must be renewed every 2 years. The Tree Expert Law states that a person may not engage in the work or business of a tree expert without a tree expert license. It further states that a person may not solicit, advertise, or represent themselves to the public as a tree expert, or assume to practice as a tree expert, or use the title or abbreviation LTE or any other word, letter, or abbreviation tending to indicate that they are licensed or are a tree expert without having received the license, or when the license has been revoked or suspended. A criminal conviction for a first offense under the Tree Expert Law is a misdemeanor and is subject to a fine up to $500. There are some relatively recent changes to the Tree Expert Law. Those include reducing the apprenticeship period from 5 years to 3 years to be able to apply to sit for the exam and a license, and it added a continuing education requirement starting September 1, 2017. A licensee is required to obtain 8 continuing education credits every 2 years. Cannot renew without completing this requirement. Even-numbered licenses renew in even-numbered years. Odd-numbered licenses renew in odd-numbered years. Another change to the law and regulations includes having to have your licensed tree expert number on all trucks, documents, ads, etc. associated with conducting your business. A tree expert is someone who represents to the public that they are skilled in the science of tree care or removal, and who, whether in the business of the person or as an employee of another person, and whether under the title of arborist, tree specialist, tree surgeon, tree expert, or otherwise, engages in the business or work of treatment, care, or removal of trees for compensation. Treatment and care of trees includes removals, pruning, chemical application, supervising the treatment of trees, consulting, making diagnosis, trimming, pruning, cabling, crown reduction, mulching, removal, etc. A tree expert does not include a person engaged in logging or timber harvesting, or in the installation of underground facilities or associated site construction, or one who treats or cares for or removes a tree that is 20 feet or less, such as those in the landscape industry. To qualify for a tree expert license, you must pay the fee provided for in the statute, have obtained 18 years of age, have 2 years of approved college education in forestry, arboriculture, horticulture, applied agricultural sciences, or the equivalent education, with a minimum of 1 year of experience with a licensed tree expert in Maryland or an acceptable tree expert company in another state. Or you must have 3 years immediately preceding the date of your application that you have been engaged continuously in practice as a tree expert with a licensed tree expert in Maryland or an acceptable tree company from another state. And you must also have passed the exam given by the department. The department may take enforcement action under the Tree Expert Law against 2 different types of violators, those that are licensed tree experts and those that are doing tree care without a license or unlicensed tree care workers. If you are a licensed tree expert, the department may permanently revoke or temporarily suspend the license of any tree expert who is found guilty of fraud or deceit in obtaining the license in the first place, or negligence or wrongful conduct in the practice of tree culture or care. It is a criminal offense to practice as a tree expert if you are under suspension or revocation of your license. The Maryland Roadside Tree Law may be another law that you encounter as a tree expert in Maryland. It was passed in 1914 as one of the oldest conservation laws in the country. It protects roadside trees, ensuring their proper care and their compatibility with a dependable public utility system. It places all trees in public road rights-of-way in the state of Maryland under the jurisdiction of the Maryland Forest Service. This includes all public rights-of-way, whether they are state, county, or municipal. The intent of the roadside tree law is to protect, conserve, and enhance Maryland's roadside trees through proper tree care and ensure compatibility of trees with dependable public utility systems, while also providing for picturesque, scenic, and safe travelways throughout the state. Definition of a roadside tree. Before a roadside tree is trimmed or cared for in any way, including the application of pesticides, pruning, mulching, removal, a tree care permit must be obtained from the Maryland Forest Service. This would be for tree care on any roadside tree, which is a plant that has a woody stem or trunk that grows all or in part within a public road right-of-way. Trees growing off right-of-way but encroaching onto the right-of-way, such as by roots, branches, etc., are not roadside trees. This graphic shows the difference between a roadside tree and one that is not a roadside tree. The green circles represent the crown and branches of the tree. The inside circle represents the trunk. As you can see from this top graphic, both the crown and the trunk are outside of the road right-of-way line. Therefore, it is not a roadside tree. This next graphic shows the foliage and the trunk within the right-of-way line, and therefore it is a roadside tree. The trunk is entirely within the road right-of-way. This graphic on the bottom shows the crown of the tree overlapping into the right-of-way, yet the trunk itself is not within the right-of-way line. Therefore, it is not a roadside tree. This graphic, however, shows a portion of the trunk just over the road right-of-way line, and therefore, even though all of the trunk is not within the road right-of-way, it is a roadside tree. Here is an example of some maple trees that were planted by the adjacent property owner on his private property. Over time, as the trees grew, the tree that is farthest in the photograph next to the road sign grew large enough to grow into the road right-of-way. A licensed tree company removed that tree without a permit. A permit is also needed to plant a tree within a public road right-of-way. When tree care is performed on a roadside tree without a permit, a fine may be assessed or more severe action taken by the Department of Natural Resources. Why are roadside tree permits necessary? For many reasons. Permits are a good tool to help to protect our roadside trees, and issuance of tree care permits is important to ensure that only beneficial and necessary tree trimming, root cutting, fertilization, or other tree maintenance practices will be done and done correctly to roadside trees. In addition, tree hazards are documented, and corrective actions, including removals and replacements, is done in a timely and safe manner by trained professionals, such as yourself as a licensed tree expert or a certified roadside tree care expert. Roadside tree permits also help to ensure that the right tree, correct species, is planted in the right location, thereby avoiding future problems and conflicts with sidewalks, overhead and underground utilities, and site distances. The example of this Norway maple that was planted in a tree lawn that was too narrow, it's damaged the curbing and the sidewalk, and it was planted underneath utility lines. The permit procedure requires that the property owner who has a roadside tree within a public road right-of-way in front of his or her property actually signs the application. If the roadside tree straddles two properties, as we discussed in earlier slides, both owners must sign the application. The permit itself does not convey ownership or grant permission to do the tree work. Permission must be sought and granted by the tree owner. Maryland has adopted the so-called Massachusetts rule that limits a landowner's remedy against encroaching vegetation to self-help in nearly all circumstances. A landowner must assume responsibility for the care and preservation of his or her own property. This self-help rule means that a neighbor can cut back encroaching limbs or roots of an adjoining neighbor's tree to the property line. With these caveats, they may not destroy the tree by the pruning, they may not cut down the tree itself, and must stop at the boundary line unless they have the neighbor's permission. The person who owns the trunk owns the tree. Any person who trespasses and removes trees, unless they work for a public service company or public roads agency, is liable for any survey or appraisal costs that may be needed, any court costs that may be incurred, and triple the amount of the value of the trees or the timber cut. Who is a trespasser? Someone who intentionally and without consent or privilege enters another's property. This is the case whether or not the person was aware they were trespassing. In this case, it's pretty obvious. There's a no trespassing sign. As a tree expert, prior to doing any tree care work, it is good to inquire as to the exact location of the property line. Tree care under the roadside tree law is defined as the removal of a roadside tree, planting or maintenance or both of a roadside tree, application of pesticide to a roadside tree, or any treatment that may affect the health or growth of a roadside tree. When trees are removed from the right-of-way, replacement of those trees may be required by the Maryland Forest Service. If that is the case, it will say this on the permit. The Maryland roadside tree law states that any tree work being done in any public road right-of-way, as we already mentioned, in the state of Maryland, whether it's state, county, or municipal, must be performed according to state regulation and supervised by a licensed tree expert or a roadside tree care expert. To clarify the difference between roadside tree care expert versus licensed tree expert, a roadside tree care expert is one that works for a governmental agency and supervises that agency's tree care program and is certified by the DNR. A licensed tree expert works in the private sector and is licensed by DNR. A roadside tree care expert is an individual representing a government agency who is designated to supervise that government's roadside tree planting and maintenance operation, has passed the Maryland Forest Service examination for roadside tree care expert, and has been certified by the Maryland Forest Service as qualified to supervise that government's tree care program. As a licensed tree expert in the state of Maryland, you may contract work with a state, county, or municipal agency working on roadside trees under a roadside tree care expert. Become familiar with the roadside tree care regulations as well as the law. The regulations require that a certified roadside tree care expert or licensed tree expert supervise or conduct tree care on any roadside tree. It requires that proper tree care standards be met and requires a permit be obtained and in place prior to performing any tree care. As a licensed tree expert, you may be contracted to do work under a roadside tree permit, or you may apply for a roadside tree permit on behalf of a client. A person may cut down or prune a roadside tree without a permit only if the tree is uprooted or broken and in contact with an electric line, its branches are in immediate danger to person or property, or it stands within the right-of-way of a dedicated but unimproved road, or any roots being pruned or impacted are 1 inch or less. There are 2 types of permits that may be issued under the roadside tree law. The first is roadside tree blanket permits. They're typically issued on an annual basis or monthly basis and are issued at no charge to other public agencies for their annual tree maintenance. It may also be issued to public utility companies, and this is a charge of $250 per crew per month or $250 per year. This is for vegetation maintenance only. A roadside tree project permit would be applied for. It costs $25 per permit for any roadside tree care not covered under a roadside tree blanket permit. This is a roadside tree blanket permit for a public agency. As you can see at the top of the page, it lists the applicant information, the permit number, that this is a public agency, and the scope of work is within Allegheny County. The proposed tree care is to eliminate hazards to property, public safety, and health, and it does so by implementing these types of tree care. There are limitations on this permit, most notably that there is a second document made part of this permit with terms and conditions that the licensed tree expert must follow. And at the bottom, it is the Maryland staff person that issued the permit and contact information. In the bottom right-hand corner is the date it was issued and whether this permit is an annual permit or a monthly permit. This is a roadside tree blanket permit for a public utility. Notice it says the applicant is not a public agency. It identifies the specific crew leader. 1 permit is issued per 1 truck and crew. This particular crew under this permit can operate in these following counties. And again, the purpose of the tree care is to eliminate hazards. In this case, pruning that's going to occur to eliminate interruptions of electric utilities. To do that, they can do these particular aspects of tree care. None of the roadside tree blanket permits to a utility company allows for tree removal. So if you're the licensed tree expert for a tree company that is implementing tree care on your crew, you have to know the specifics of your permit. We may also include specific information about what the permittee is allowed to do or not do. Please make sure you read that. And again, at the bottom, it will show the reviewers and permit issuer name and contact information, and who is the tree expert that will be supervising this work. Again, these permits can be issued monthly, so be sure to check the bottom of the page to see how long the permit is valid. If, as a tree expert, you are conducting or supervising tree care work under a blanket permit, there may be a separate document made part of that permit that are the terms and conditions upon which you are beholden while implementing work under the permit. If tree care cannot be accomplished under a roadside tree blanket permit for a municipal or county or state agency or a public utility, then a roadside tree individual or project permit is applied for. In this case, again, you see that there's the contact information of the applicant at the top of the page. What is the scope of the permit? It is to remove 5 trees. Who is the applicant? The person whose property is adjacent to the trees. And what are the particulars of the permit? And in this case, it states the trees that are removed and some specific information about those trees. If there's any limitation on the permit, it'll be stated here. In this case, 5 trees have to be planted back. There's specific information about rights and responsibilities. Then the reviewer and permit authorized name and contact information, and who will be the LTE performing and supervising the work. Also, again, at the bottom of the page, it states how long the permit is valid for.
When tree care is performed on a roadside tree without a permit, a fine may be assessed or more severe actions may be taken by the Department of Natural Resources, Natural Resource Police.
The permit approval process. If as a tree expert you apply for a roadside tree permit on behalf of a client, you would submit that to the Maryland Forest Service office in your area accompanied by a $25 check. Our staff reviews the site, and if approved, the permit is processed and mailed or emailed to the applicant. The permits are valid for 1 year and can be renewed upon request. Once issued, work may begin according to the terms and conditions of the permit, so be sure to read the permit carefully and do not begin work prior to receiving an approved permit. A permit is not a work order. The permittee is not obligated to perform the work. However, if they do, it must be performed according to those terms and conditions in the permit. If a roadside tree permit application is denied, there is an appeal process. If a permit is denied, the $25 fee is returned to the applicant with a letter explaining the decision. The applicant has the right of appeal, and appeals must be made in writing no later than 10 days after the date on which the denial, suspension, or revocation notice is served. The third law covered in this presentation is the Reforestation Law of 1988. It is commonly referred to as 5103, which is the Natural Resources Article citation. It states that when highway construction using state funds causes the cutting or clearing of 1 acre or more of forest land, then these trees need to be replaced. Replacement is on a 1-for-1 basis, meaning if 1 acre of forest is removed, 1 acre needs to be planted. If less than 1 acre is removed, then the roadside tree law, previously discussed, applies. The last law we'll cover in this presentation is the Forest Conservation Act of 1991. The Act states that any activity requiring an application for a subdivision, a grading permit, or sediment erosion control permit on a land area of 40,000 square feet or greater is subject to the Act. This law is administered by local governments with planning and zoning authority and by the Maryland Forest Service for any project by a state or federal agency. One of the provisions of the Act is to protect specimen trees that are 30 inches or greater or 75% of the diameter of a current state champion. As a tree expert, you may be contracted to provide tree care for one of these specimen trees.
We hope you found this supplemental presentation to be helpful as you prepare for the Roadside Tree Care Expert exam. This concludes the study content on tree laws and standards. Please proceed to the next presentation. Welcome to this online course content that supports preparing to take the Maryland Roadside Tree Care Expert exam. This supplemental presentation to the study guide is intended to aid those individuals who are preparing to take the Maryland Roadside Tree Care Expert exam as required for permitting under the Maryland Roadside Tree Law. Anyone managing a tree care program for a municipal, county, or state agency must have a certification to supervise tree care work under a roadside tree permit issued by the Maryland Forest Service of the Maryland Department of Natural Resources. This presentation corresponds to the information in the online study guide. The text of the study guide, version 3.0, may be found at dnr.maryland.gov/forests. Click on the Urban and Community Forestry tab at the top of the page, and then Roadside Tree Law in the menu on the left-hand side of the web page. Maryland Roadside Tree Care Expert Exam, Study Guide version 3.0, Chapter 2, Tree Biology.
During the course of this presentation, keep in mind what a tree needs to grow. These include light, air, water, nutrients, and the often forgotten need, space. Trees are living beings made up of cells, and cells are the building blocks of life. This photo shows twig wood from an American beech at 200 magnification. Trees are living beings made up of cells, and cells are the building blocks of life. In plants, new cells come from the division of existing cells. Tree cell division occurs in structures called meristems, or in meristematic tissue. Following division, cells undergo differentiation. This changes the structure and allows cells to assume specific functions. When cells elongate at tips and roots, this is at the point of the apical meristem. When lateral buds are inhibited by the active growth of the terminal buds, this is called apical dominance. Trees go up and out from the tips. This presentation will cover the following tree components: roots, trunk and stem, crown and leaves, fruits and flowers. Please note on this graphic the root system of this tree. It extends quite far horizontally, but depth into the soil is only approximately 24 inches. Trees that lose their leaves every year are called deciduous. Trees that hold their leaves for more than 1 year are called evergreen. Needles and scales of conifer trees perform the same function as leaves of broadleaf trees. Leaves are the food producers of the trees. Leaf function includes photosynthesis, transpiration, and respiration. Photosynthesis is the process of turning carbon dioxide and water into simple carbohydrates and oxygen driven by the energy of the sun. It is the process by which green plants use light to build sugar molecules. Literally, the word photosynthesis means putting together with light. Much of the photosynthate made through the photosynthetic process is stored in the form of sugar or starches in twigs, trunks, and roots for later energy requirements. The energy created and stored by this photosynthetic process must be greater than the energy used in the respiration process. Respiration is when the sugars are used combined with oxygen to produce usable cellular energy for the plant's processes. If the photosynthetic material does not exceed the respiration energy use, the tree uses up its energy reserves. If this occurs over time, the tree may run out of energy reserves and die. Fall colors result from the breakdown of green chlorophyll in the leaves, and the expression of the other pigments begin to show. They were always present in the leaf. You can just see them when the green chlorophyll starts to break down. Anthocyanins produce red and purple colors, and carotenoids produce the yellow, oranges, and red colors. Respiration is the process by which chemical energy is used by the tree for all of its biological functions. In this process, the bonds of sugars and starches are broken, yielding energy, carbon dioxide, and water. Respiration occurs at all times, and oxygen is required for normal respiration to occur. The energy created and stored by photosynthesis must be greater than the energy used in this respiration process. Otherwise, the tree uses up its energy reserves, and if this occurs over time, the tree may run out of energy reserves and start to decline or die. Transpiration is the loss of water in the form of water vapor from leaf surfaces. The evaporation of water cools the leaves and creates a transpirational pool that moves water up through the xylem of the tree. About 95% of the water absorbed by a plant is transpired. The rate of transpiration is affected by factors such as temperature, humidity, and available water. Transpiration is also affected by cuticle thickness on the leaf, the presence or absence of hair on the leaf surface, and the number and location of stomata, which are the small pores between two guard cells that regulate gas exchange. As an example, a plant with thick cuticle, small leaves, and sunken stomata are best adapted to hot, dry conditions. This graphic shows the cross-section of a leaf. Discussed in the previous slide are the cuticle. A thick cuticle example may be that, say, of a rhododendron, and at the bottom of the slide are the guard cells and stomate. When water is deficient, the stomate close via the guard cell. This is to reduce the loss of water through transpiration. Photosynthesis slows down, and the visible symptom you may see is wilting. Stomata are also the opening through which the tree absorbs carbon dioxide and releases oxygen. Twigs are small stems that provide the support structure for leaves, flowers, and fruits. Branches support the twigs. Buds can occur along the twig at the base of each leaf, just under the bark, or at the tip of each twig. A bud is an unexpanded shoot or flower. Terminal bud scale scars are useful in measuring twig elongation. You can measure annual tree growth by measuring the distance between terminal bud scale scars, or nodes. The area between two nodes is known as an internode. See if you can identify the different portions of this twig before the labels appear on the screen. Did you get them all correct? Flowers are the reproductive structures of some trees. A complete flower is one that contains all four floral organs, which are petals, sepals, one or more carpels, which is the female reproductive organ, and stamens, which is the male reproductive organ. A complete flower is one that contains all four of these. Tree fruits can take many forms, and we'll discuss some of those in the Tree ID module of these presentations. Angiosperms are flowering plants whose seeds are enclosed in an ovary. Gymnosperms, or naked seed plants, are those that have no outer covering. Let's look at this graphic of the cross-section of a tree stem. The stem of the tree functions in the conduction of water and minerals to support the tree and in the storage of carbohydrate reserves. The outer covering of tree branch or stem is the bark, indicated by letter A in this graphic. The bark functions to moderate temperature, defend against insects and injury, and reduce water loss. You may also see small openings in the bark that are visible. These are called lenticels, and they allow for gas exchange. The cambium, labeled E in your graphic, is a very thin continuous sheath of radially dividing cells that produces the xylem to the inside, indicated by D in your graphic, and phloem to the outside, indicated by B. The phloem carries sugars and food down from the leaves to the rest of the tree. The The xylem carries water and nutrients up from the roots to the rest of the tree. Some people distinguish the difference between xylem and phloem by remembering that xy goes to the sky. The xylem, or the area of active living wood, functions to transport water and nutrients, store food and water, and provide support for the tree. It can be thought of as a continuous column of water, where the evaporation of molecules from the leaves pulls the water up through the tree. Xylem is also called sapwood, indicated by letter D in your graphic. Farther inside the tree is the dark wood, called the heartwood. This is labeled C in your graphic. This is composed of dead cells and provides support for the tree. Growth rings are the annual production of xylem by the cambium. They are visible because of the contrast between colors. The light-colored ring is early or spring wood and tends to be thicker. This is a period of very active growth for the tree in the spring. The dark-colored ring comes later in the season and is called summerwood. It tends to be a thinner ring and darker in color. If you wanted to know a year's growth, you have to combine the light and dark ring together for 1 year. Radial transport is the horizontal movement of water or nutrients between cells through the ray cells. Rays are channels of cells where water, nutrients, and carbohydrates move laterally through the tree across the stem. Xylem rays in the sapwood are the pathway for food movements to and from the phloem. If you'll remember from earlier slides, the phloem is just under the bark of the tree. The annual production of layers of tissue at the junction of the branch to the stem forms a shoulder or bulge called the branch collar. This is an important biologic guide for when we do pruning cuts. Reaction wood is abnormal wood formed in response to lean or similar mechanical stress that tries to return the tree to vertical form. It is formed in the main stem of a leaning tree or inclined tree, and it's formed in branches. The function of reaction wood is to bring the main stem or the branch back to a normal position. A vertical trunk forms normal wood plus some of reaction wood when it moves in the wind. Horizontal branches and leaning branches must form reaction wood in an attempt to prevent them from bending and cracking under their own weight. Compression wood forms on the underside of branches and contains more lignin than normal wood. Wood with a high lignin content is especially strong in compression. Tension wood forms on the upper side of hardwoods and contains more cellulose than the normal wood. Wood with a high cellulose content is especially strong in tension and can resist bending downward, which is good in a branch. Both strategies are helpful to the tree. Overall tree form tends to either be X-current or D-current. Most trees start out with some sort of X-current traits when they are juveniles, but over time they may tend toward one form or the other. X-current trees tend to have strong apical control, resulting in that upright tree with strong central leaders. You see this in species like your conifers, maybe sweet gum, tulip poplar. The D-current tree form is when your lateral shoots outgrow the original terminal shoot year after year. That results in that rounded head or decurrent form. This can be most commonly seen in trees like your maples. Let's look at the root system of trees. 1/3 to 1/2 the volume or biomass of the tree is underground. Imagine pulling a tree out of the ground, shaking the soil off and weighing it. Half of that weight can be the root system of the tree. Because roots need oxygen in order to grow, trees don't normally grow well in compacted or oxygen-poor soils or waterlogged soils. As a tree expert, you may encounter trees in very compacted soils in an urban setting, or perhaps you're called in to do some tree care work on trees that have been involved in a flood situation. The root collar is usually at or near the ground line and is marked by a swelling of the tree trunk. When we see young trees that have recently been planted start to fail from the top of the tree down, one thing that we can look for is to see if the root collar has been buried below the soil line. Some species do have taproots that grow straight down 3 to 7 feet or more until it encounters an impenetrable layer or there's insufficient supplies of oxygen for the roots to grow. Typically, as a tree expert in an urban environment in Maryland, you will not see this. The framework of major roots usually lies less than 12 inches below the soil surface. It often grows out very wide horizontally, as much as 1 to 2 times the height of the tree. If you can imagine laying the tree on its side on the ground, roots often extend 1 to 2 times that length. The feeder roots grow outward and upward from those framework roots. These smaller roots form mats of thousands of fine, short, non-woody roots. These slender roots with their tiny root hairs provide the major portion of the absorptive surface of a tree's root system. They compete directly with the roots of grasses and other ground covers. This is why we encourage mulching around a tree to reduce some of that competition from grass and other ground covers. A healthy root system, when you evaluate it, should be white in color. Let's look at the function of root systems as it radiates away from the trunk of the tree. The large woody roots have the main function of anchoring or keeping the tree up. The next lateral roots have functions that include anchorage, conduction of water and nutrients, and storage of the sugars from the photosynthetic process. The fine absorptive roots are small fibrous primary tissues that have epidermal cells that are modified into root hairs, and it's these fine root hairs that aid in uptake of water and minerals. Water and essential elements are absorbed from the soil by the roots. Some water is used for growth and metabolism, but most is lost through evaporation. This water loss creates transpirational pull that moves water through the xylem. Too little or too much soil moisture can result in leaf water deficits. Water deficits can cause slowed photosynthesis, stomatal closure, as we've already discussed, and wilting leaves. If the water potential is lower in the soil, water will actually move out of the roots into the soil. For example, when salt concentrations are high in the soil from de-icing or excessive fertilization, water can be drawn out of the roots, causing what's called fertilizer burn. The roots of most plant species live in a symbiotic relationship with certain fungi. The term mycorrhizae means fungus roots. The fungi aid the roots in absorption of water and essential minerals, while the fungi derive nourishment from the roots. Mycorrhizae increase the root's ability to absorb water and essential elements. The fungi are essential to the health of the plant. They form a symbiotic or mutually beneficial relationship with the roots and act as an extension of the tree's root systems by increasing their absorption of water and nutrients. Mycorrhizal fungi produce structures called hyphae that allow them to forage for some nutrients more efficiently than the roots can do alone. The fungi transfer some of these nutrients to the roots and in return receive carbohydrates. Because the relationship between trees and mycorrhizae are symbiotic, both the tree and the fungi benefit. Mycorrhizae are more effective than the tree roots at accumulating the water and nutrients, and they can store excess nutrients, releasing them to the tree as it's needed. Nutrient uptake, particularly that of phosphorus, is enhanced in infertile soils because the mycelial strands in their protruding hyphae explore the soil more extensively than non-mycorrhizal roots. The fungi also inhibit invasion by damaging fungi and can extend the life to root tips. Mycorrhizae release acids that break down substances that the tree cannot use without their help. and they can fix nitrogen from both the soils and the atmosphere so it becomes more available to the trees. Mycorrhizal fungi produce hormones that encourage the production of new root tip growth, which aids both the tree and the fungi. The fungi cannot manufacture their own food due to lack of chlorophyll. That process, as you may remember, that converts sunlight to energy to use to produce sugars. Therefore, the fungi must get this food from the chlorophyll-producing plants. They do this by either penetrating the plant's roots or forming a sheath around the root tip. This energy allows the fungi to reproduce and form large networks within the soil structure. A process unique to trees is the ability to compartmentalize decay. Compartmentalization is a process by which the tree might limit the spread of discoloration and decay. After a tree's been wounded, reactions are triggered in the tree which cause it to form boundaries around the wounded area. This model was developed by Dr. Alex Shigo. It's known as coated, and it means compartmentalization of decay in trees. In the model, Shigo outlines 4 barriers or walls of defense. Wall 1 tries to resist vertical spread by plugging up the xylem vessels. You may remember xylem is the means by which the tree transports water and nutrients. Wall 2 resists spread inward into the tree by that more compact summer wood that we discussed, and by depositing chemicals in those cells. Wall 3 inhibits the lateral spread by activating those ray cells to resist the decay. These 3 walls of defense are called the reaction zone. Then the 4th wall, which is often considered the strongest wall of defense, is the formation of callus wood and protects against the outward spread of the decay. Wall 1 is the weakest wall of defense. Wall 4 is the strongest wall of defense. At times, the tree cannot resist the spread of really aggressive pathogens. It is often common for walls 1, 2, and 3 to fail, allowing the decay to spread inside the tree. That's when you start to see hollows forming or a cavity. Wall 4 rarely fails, except where canker-causing fungi restrict its development or actually kill the cambium that's trying to create that callus wood. Here is another graphic of what coated may look like on a tree. Wall 1 and 2 in this graphic have failed in keeping the spread of the pathogen or decay in the tree. Wall 4, again the strongest wall of defense, has started to create new wood. This may look like callus rolls, or what people often refer to as ram's horns. Here's a photograph of a large diameter tulip poplar. Can you identify the different walls of defense on this tree? As you can see in this photograph, Wall 4 forms to stop the spread of decay to the new wood growth as the tree grows radially. The person that made these pruning cuts did so properly without interrupting the tissues needed to form that callus wood. If the tree is vigorous enough and this callus wood can close over the wound, then the tree will be protected from the spread of decay. Understanding the coated model helps us to understand why we do not top trees. As you can see, half of wall 1 has been eliminated. Walls 2 and 3 are exposed to decay and disease, and the sprout growth is only supported by wall 4 and is not attached as a properly formed branch.
We hope you found this supplemental presentation to be helpful as you prepare for the Roadside Tree Care Expert exam. This concludes the study content on tree biology. Please proceed to the next presentation. Welcome to this online course content that supports preparing to take the Maryland Roadside Tree Care Expert exam. This supplemental presentation to the study guide is intended to aid those individuals who are preparing to take the Maryland Roadside Tree Care Expert exam as required for permitting under the Maryland Roadside Tree Law. Anyone managing a tree care program for a municipal, county, or state agency must have a certification to supervise tree care work under a roadside tree permit issued by the Maryland Forest Service of the Maryland Department of Natural Resources. This presentation corresponds to the information in the online study guide. The text of the study guide, version 3.0, may be found at dnr.maryland.gov/forests. Click on the Urban and Community Forestry tab at the top of the page, and then Roadside Tree Law in the menu on the left-hand side of the web page. Maryland Roadside Tree Care Expert Exam, Study Guide version 3.0, Chapter 3, Soil and Water.
Soil is very important to plant health and success. It provides plants with nutrients, root anchorage, and water. What is the difference between soil and dirt? Soil is alive. It contains minerals, air, water, animals, living matter, the waste of the animals, decaying bodies of plants and animals. It is alive and it provides the nutrients needed to promote plant growth. Dirt is disassociated from its ecosystem. It is not alive and is not the same as soil to support plant growth. Though soil appears solid when you look at it with a casual eye, the ideal soil is made up of solids and voids. An ideal soil is 50% solids and 50% pore space, which contains water and air. The solid portion is mostly mineral soil with a percentage of organic matter. The voids are pore space or gaps between the particles of soil. The pore space allows for air and water exchange and uptake by plant roots. The term soil texture refers to the size of the particles in the soil. There are three main types of particles: sand, silt, and clay, that you can see written on the outside of this triangle. Sand is the largest, clay is the smallest particle, and silt is intermediate. Because sand particles are the largest, sandy soils drain very well but do not hold water well. Soils with high clay content do not drain well. They hold water and flood easily because they have fine particles and little pore space. This is why clay soils make great liners for ponds. Most soils have some combination of the three soil types. This is ideal for plants, the area inside the yellow star. A loam soil combines the desirable attributes of each particle size, exhibits intermediate characteristics, and is ideal for growing a wide variety of plants. The space between soil particles can either be large, called macropores, or small, called micropores. When all pore space, both micropores and macropores in the soil, are filled with water, the soil is considered to be saturated. When excess water drains away and soil pores are primarily filled with air, but water is held by the soil particles, the soil is considered to be at field capacity. This is a desirable state as plants have both air and water available. When both the water in the pore spaces and the water held by the soil particles are gone, drought conditions begin. Plants in drought conditions may wilt due to water loss and ultimately reach the permanent wilting point, when the water is so tightly held by the soil particles that it is unavailable to the plants. This is the point of no return for plants, the point at which they will die if adequate water is not added to the soil. The capacity of a soil to absorb or gather positively charged ions is called its cation exchange capacity. The cation exchange capacity of a soil can be determined by a soil test. It is important because it indicates the ability of a soil to attract and hold elements and nutrients that plants need for growth, and is a measure of soil fertility. The term pH refers to the acidity or alkalinity of a soil. The soil pH can also be determined by a soil test. The pH is important because various nutrients required by plants bind to the soil and become unavailable at certain pH ranges, as you can see from this chart. This is why the American National Standards Institute standards state that soil pH shall be considered when selecting a fertilizer. The pH of the soil may limit the availability of a nutrient, even if you apply a considerable amount of it. The pH ranges vary depending on the nutrient in question, again, as you can see in this chart, and is one reason why certain plants flourish in a particular pH range. You'll note that neutral pH, which is number 7, has availability of many of the nutrients on this chart at that pH. Compaction, one of the biggest problems in urban soils, can be caused by pedestrian and vehicular traffic or grading or other construction activities. In preparing soils for structures, roads, and pavement, engineering specifications usually require that load-bearing soil be compacted to anywhere from 90 to 97%. While this compaction provides stability to buildings and other improvements, it is certainly bad for trees. When compacted to meet load-bearing engineering specifications, soil is almost impenetrable to tree roots. The best way to address soil compaction is to prevent it in the first place. Compacted soils are very difficult to remedy after the fact. Sometimes people try to remedy compaction by adding organic material to the soil, but in most cases this will not be of any particular benefit. Remember, a good soil is mostly mineral soil with a lot of pore space. Once the soil structure is destroyed by compaction, it is hard to get those pore spaces back. As learned in the biology chapter, mycorrhizae are fungi that live in a symbiotic relationship with roots and increase the root's ability to absorb water and essential elements. These occur naturally in forest soils, but may be lacking in urban soils. Many urban soils are low in organic matter due to the fact that nutrient cycling is often interrupted because plant debris, such as leaves and twigs, are generally removed. In forests, leaf litter decomposition creates a zone of complex biologic activity that is beneficial to trees. In urban areas, these processes are somewhat simulated through the use of organic mulch. The most beneficial times to irrigate plants are late at night or early in the morning. Evaporation is minimized and the foliage has a chance to dry during peak daylight hours, reducing the opportunity for the spread of fungal pests if watering is done in the early morning. Anti-transpirants are sometimes used to reduce plant water loss through transpiration. They are best used over short periods of time, and a proper soil moisture regimen is preferable. Tensiometers or soil moisture sensors used to measure soil wetness or dryness. They can be very useful in establishing and monitoring the soil regimen for trees being managed.
The characteristics of a site soil may be significantly altered when the site development occurs. Many urban soils are low in organic matter due to the fact that nutrient cycling is often interrupted. Plant debris is generally removed from the soil surface. In forests, leaf litter decomposition creates a zone of complex biological activity that is beneficial to trees. In urban areas, these processes are often simulated through the use of organic mulch. We hope you found this supplemental presentation to be helpful as you prepare for the Roadside Tree Care Expert exam. This concludes the study content on soil and water. Please proceed to the next presentation. Welcome to this online course content that supports preparing to take the Maryland Roadside Tree Care Expert exam. This supplemental presentation to the study guide is intended to aid those individuals who are preparing to take the Maryland Roadside Tree Care Expert exam as required for permitting under the Maryland Roadside Tree Law. Anyone managing a tree care program for a municipal, county, or state agency must have a certification to supervise tree care work under a roadside tree permit issued by the Maryland Forest Service of the Maryland Department of Natural Resources. This presentation corresponds to the information in the online study guide. The text of the study guide, version 3.0, may be found at dnr.maryland.gov/forests. Click on the Urban and Community Forestry tab at the top of the page, and then Roadside Tree Law in the menu on the left-hand side of the web page. Maryland Roadside Tree Care Expert Exam, Study Guide version 3.0. Chapter 4, Tree Nutrition, Fertilization, and Mulching.
Fertilization should not be undertaken without establishing an objective. Why are you fertilizing the plant? To induce growth? To make up for a nutrient deficiency in the soil? Knowing why you are fertilizing will drive other decisions in the process, such as fertilizer type and application rates. A nutrient is an element or compound required for plant growth, reproduction, or development. Nutrients are categorized as macronutrients, needed in relatively large quantities by the plant, secondary nutrients, needed in relatively moderate quantities, and micronutrients, needed in relatively small quantities. These nutrients are listed in this chart. The nutrient to which plants most commonly respond is nitrogen. Nitrogen is what most fertilizer prescriptions are based on. Soil and/or foliar nutrient analysis should be used to determine the need for fertilizer. In the absence of soil and/or foliar nutrient analysis, fertilizers with higher ratios of phosphorus and potassium should be avoided. Nitrogen often comes in salt form. However, salt can dry out and damage plant tissue. This is where the term fertilizer burn comes from. This is why ANSI standards say that fertilizer with a salt index of less than 50 should be preferred. When planning your fertilizer application, be sure to consider factors that affect fertilizer uptake. What is the tree health and vigor? What is the age of the tree? Water availability. This is often the most limiting factor. What is the soil composition and what form of fertilizer are you applying? A fertilizer analysis is the composition expressed as a percentage by weight of nutrients in the fertilizer. A fertilizer that contains nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium is called a complete fertilizer. The three numbers listed on the packaging of a complete fertilizer stand for the percentages of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium present in the bag. For example, a 100-pound bag of 10-10-10 fertilizer has 10% each of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, and so therefore contains 10 pounds of nitrogen, 10 pounds of phosphorus, and 10 pounds of potassium. Slow-release fertilizers should be applied at rates between 2 and 4 pounds of actual nitrogen per 1,000 square foot of treatment area. However, slow-release fertilizers should be applied at rates that do not exceed 6 pounds of actual nitrogen per 1,000 square feet within a 1-year period. This is important if you plan to fertilize more than once a year. Quick-release fertilizers should be applied at rates of 1 to 2 pounds of actual nitrogen per 1,000 square feet of application area. It is important to remember that fertilizers are salts. When salt concentrations are high in the soil from excess fertilizer application, water can be drawn out of the roots, causing fertilizer burn. These trees were harmed by de-icing chemicals, also a salt, and this picture was taken during July. How do you calculate the amount of fertilizer needed? You need to know the following information. The size of the area to be fertilized. The fertilization area will be determined by you as the tree expert. The amount of nutrient, normally you're applying it based on the amount of nitrogen, that you want to apply over the 1,000 square foot area. This will vary depending on whether you use a slow release or quick release fertilizer. You also need to know the fertilizer analysis that you intend to use. Let's look at an example on how to calculate how many pounds of fertilizer is needed for an application. In this case, we have a large mature tree that needs 2 pounds of nitrogen per 1,000 square foot application. In our example, our fertilizer has an analysis of 10-6-4. That means 10% is nitrogen. You start by measuring the approximate area to be fertilized. Generally, this is from the trunk to near the drip line of the tree. The drip line is the distance from the trunk that the branches reach. If you were to draw an imaginary vertical line from the furthest most leaf from the trunk to the ground, that would be your drip line. If the root zone is 25 feet by 25 feet in our example, 25 times 25 is 625 square feet. The amount of fertilizer is based on the actual nitrogen, remember. The recommended rate is 2 pounds of actual nitrogen per 1,000 square feet of treatment area. We're only fertilizing 625 square feet using our 10-6-4 fertilizer at the rate of 2 pounds per 1,000 square feet of nitrogen. This would require 12.5 pounds of the bag of the 10-6-4 fertilizer to treat the entire 625 square foot area. Let's look at our formula. We begin with the nitrogen application rate, which in this case is 2 pounds per 1,000 square feet. We divide that by the content of the fertilizer bag expressed as a decimal. In our case, our analysis was 10-6-4, so this appears as 0.10. The next number we need is the square feet to be fertilized. We determined this was 625 square feet of area, divided by the 1,000 square foot application rate. When you carry the math forward, it gives you 12.5 pounds of fertilizer is needed for this application. The preferred method of fertilization application where turf or ground covers exist is subsurface liquid application. However, other methods may also be used. When applying a subsurface liquid fertilizer injection sites should be 12 inches to 36 inches apart and 4 to 8 inches deep so that you're sure you're within the root zone.
Another important part of tree care is mulching. Mulch is defined as the materials placed on the soil surface to reduce moisture evaporation and improve soil conditions. Mulch provides organic matter to the soil around the tree as it decomposes. It also retains soil moisture, helps reduce turf and weed competition, and helps keep string trimmers and mowers away from the trunk. There are two types of mulch, organic mulches and inorganic mulches. It is important to use organic mulch because they add organic material to the soil as they decompose. Examples include wood chips, bark, pine needles, and other waste materials from plants. Inorganic mulches are less desirable, each for different reasons. Crushed stone can contain limestone, which raises the pH of the soil. Fabrics and geotextiles need to be porous to allow air and moisture to reach the tree roots. Plastics will reduce water and air exchange that is essential to tree health. Ideally, mulch should be placed from the trunk of the tree to the drip line. The drip line is the furthest point of the crown away from the main trunk. Be sure to keep the mulch from actually touching the trunk. If you cannot mulch all the way to the drip line, you should mulch at least 3 feet in each direction. Further out is better. Mulch should be laid at a minimum of 2 inches, but no more than 4. Deeper mulch is not better. For young trees, the mulch should be laid in a donut ring, which keeps the mulch from touching the trunk and helps to retain more water. The mulch should not touch the trunk of the tree because it can create a moist and warm environment against the trunk, which can result in rotting the tree from the base. Excessive mulch can also create girdling roots that will eventually grow to suffocate the tree. It is common to see these so-called mulch volcanoes in the urban and suburban environments. Often these trees with excessive mulch are in poor condition. Say no to mulch volcanoes. Here are some common examples of what not to do when mulching. In the photo on the left, note the discoloration of the stem just below the mulch line. This is the start of decay that will eventually kill the tree. On the right is an example of excessive mulching. 10 to 11 inches is far more than the desired 2 to 4 inches. Let's recap. Mulch should be placed in a thin, wide circle around the trunk of the tree without actually touching the trunk. Mulch should be 2 to 4 inches deep. If you can, mulch all the way to the drip line. If not, aim for 3 to 6 feet wide. Say no to mulch volcanoes. Mulch should be checked annually and may need to be replaced every year or every other year. Another tip if you are having trouble with grass competition is to lay a layer of cardboard or a few layers of newspaper over the grass and lay the mulch on top. The paper will decompose and reduce the amount of grass or weeds that would be able to grow up through the mulch. We hope you found this supplemental presentation to be helpful as you prepare for the Roadside Tree Care Expert exam. This concludes the study content on tree nutrition, fertilization, and mulching. Please proceed to the next presentation. Welcome to this online course content that supports preparing to take the Maryland Roadside Tree Care Expert exam. This supplemental presentation to the study guide is intended to aid those individuals who are preparing to take the Maryland Roadside Tree Care Expert exam as required for permitting under the Maryland Roadside Tree Law. Anyone managing a tree care program for a municipal, county, or state agency must have a certification to supervise tree care work under a roadside tree permit issued by the Maryland Forest Service of the Maryland Department of Natural Resources. This presentation corresponds to the information in the online study guide. The text of the study guide, version 3.0, may be found at dnr.maryland.gov/forests. Click on the Urban and Community Forestry tab at the top of the page, and then Roadside Tree Law in the menu on the left-hand side of the web page. Maryland Roadside Tree Care Expert Exam, Study Guide version 3.0, Chapter 5, Tree Pruning.
Pruning operations should start with the question why. Pruning objectives should be established prior to beginning any pruning operation. Pruning is defined as the selective removal of plant parts. The objective of your pruning is to produce strong, healthy, attractive plants. Specifications for pruning are to include the location and size of parts to be removed, the pruning objective, and the pruning type that will be employed. Here is a pruning specification workflow or flow chart. First, establish your pruning objectives. Then, establish the pruning type to be used to meet those objectives. For instance, raising the crown, reducing the crown, thinning the crown, or cleaning the crown. Then, specify the plant locations to be removed and specify the size or range of plant parts to be pruned. Equipment and work practices that damage living tissue and bark beyond the scope of work should be avoided. Climbing spurs shall not be used when climbing and pruning trees, except under special circumstances noted in the ANSI A300 pruning standards. These include when limbs are more than a throw line apart with no other means of climbing the tree, when there is thick outer bark so that the cambium will not be damaged, in remote utility rights-of-way situations, and of course during emergencies. Branches with strong U-shaped attachment should be retained, while branches with V-shaped attachment and included bark should be removed. Branch attachments with included or ingrown bark are often found on trees with V-shaped crotches, codominant stems, and sharp-angled branch attachments. A pruning cut that removes a branch at its point of origin shall be made close to the trunk or parent branch without cutting into the branch bark ridge or collar and without leaving a stub. A pruning cut that reduces the length of a branch or parent stem should bisect the angle between its branch bark ridge and an imaginary line perpendicular to the branch or stem. To prevent damage to the parent limb when removing a branch with a narrow branch attachment, the final cut should be made from the outside of the branch inward. If a limb is large enough that the cambium may rip during pruning, it should be removed by making 3 cuts. The first cut eliminates the chance of bark tearing as the limb is removed. The second cut allows the limb to drop smoothly when the weight is released. The third cut removes the remaining stub. Severed limbs should be removed from the crown of the tree upon completion of the pruning, at the end of the workday, or at times when the tree will be unattended. When necessary, ropes or other equipment shall be used to lower large branches or portion of branches to the ground. Limbs that cannot be safely controlled by hand or free dropped shall have a separate rigging line tied to them to help control their fall. Flush cuts that impact branch collar can cause ring shakes or cracks, discolored wood, and a greater risk of decay. Wound treatment should not be used to cover wounds or pruning cuts. Topping is defined by ANSI A300 as the reduction of tree size by cutting live branches and leaders to stubs without regard to long-term tree health or structural integrity. Topping is not an acceptable pruning practice. Topping is not an alternative term for crown reduction, directional pruning, or drop crotch pruning, or lateral pruning, and is different from pollarding. Topping has been shown to increase the risk of tree failure. A heading cut is defined as the reduction of a shoot, stem, or branch back to a bud or lateral branch not large enough to assume the terminal role. Heading should be considered an acceptable practice for shrub pruning and specialty pruning, but not for other types of pruning. For most conifers, if branches are headed back to older wood with no foliage, the branch stub usually dies. Cutting back to a lateral that is insufficient in size is much like topping. To meet the defined pruning objective, the growth cycle of the species, the structure of the species, and the type of pruning to be performed should be considered. The Maryland Forest Service requires that not more than 25% of the foliage on a mature tree should be removed within a growing season. Not more than 25% of the foliage of a branch or limb should be removed in a single growing season when it is cut back to a lateral. That lateral should be at least 1/3 the diameter of the removed portion so that it can assume apical dominance. Excessive removal of the laterals and foliage from the interior portion of a branch is called lion's tailing. The negative effects of lion's tailing include reduced branch taper, sunburned bark tissue, and weakened branch structure and breakage. Topping and lion's tailing are considered unacceptable practices for pruning trees. In the following series of slides, the following pruning types will be covered: structure pruning, crown cleaning or deadwooding, crown thinning, crown raising or elevation, crown reduction through lateral direction or drop crotch pruning, crown restoration, pollarding, vista, and espalier. Structural pruning is a selective removal of live branches to improve tree and branch architecture, primarily on young or medium-aged trees. The size and location of leaders or branches to be subordinated or removed should be specified. The dominant leader should be selected for development, and strong, properly spaced scaffold branch structure should be selected and maintained by reducing or removing other branches. Interfering, overextended, defective, weak, and poorly attached branches should also be removed or reduced. Crown cleaning is the selective removal of dead, diseased, detached, and broken branches. The location of parts and the size range of parts shall be specified. Crown thinning is the selective removal of live branches to reduce crown density. Thinning should result in an even distribution of branches on individual branches and throughout the crown. The percentage of foliage, the location and size of parts to be removed shall be specified. Crown raising is the selective removal of branches to provide vertical clearance. The location and size of the parts to be removed should be specified. The clearance distance shall also be specified. After pruning, the ratio of live crown to the total tree height should be at least 2/3. Crown reduction is the selective removal of branches and stems to decrease the height and or spread of a tree. Consideration shall be given to the ability of a species to tolerate this type of pruning. The location of parts to be removed and the clearance requirements shall be specified. This method, sometimes called drop crotch pruning, results in a more natural appearance, increases the time before pruning is needed again, and minimizes stress on the tree. Crown reduction should be accomplished with reduction cuts, not heading cuts. Crown restoration consists of selective removal of branches, sprouts, and stubs to redevelop structure, form, and appearance of trees that have been either severely pruned, vandalized, or damaged. The location and size range of parts and the percentage of sprouts to be removed should be specified. Pollarding is a tree training system that involves severe heading the first year, followed by annual sprout removal. Pollarding is not topping. Management plans shall be made prior to the start of the pollarding process for routine removal of the sprouts. Consideration shall be given to the ability of the individual tree to respond to pollarding. Vista pruning consists of the use of one or more pruning methods to enhance a specific line of sight, such as the view for this lake. Pruning methods shall be specified. The size range of parts, location in the tree, and the percentage foliage to be removed should be specified. Espalier is the combination of pruning, supporting, and training branches to orient a plant in one plane. Ties should be replaced as needed to prevent girdling the branches at the attachment site. In this photograph, it's being used to create a living fence at the American Horticultural Society headquarters office in Alexandria, Virginia.
We hope you found this supplemental presentation to be helpful as you prepare for the Roadside Tree Care Expert exam. This concludes the study content on tree pruning. Please proceed to the next presentation. Welcome to this online course content that supports preparing to take the Maryland Roadside Tree Care Expert exam. This supplemental presentation to the study guide is intended to aid those individuals who are preparing to take the Maryland Roadside Tree Care Expert exam as required for permitting under the Maryland Roadside Tree Law. Anyone managing a tree care program for a municipal, county, or state agency must have a certification to supervise tree care work under a roadside tree permit issued by the Maryland Forest Service of the Maryland Department of Natural Resources. This presentation corresponds to the information in the online study guide. The text of the study guide, version 3.0, may be found at dnr.maryland.gov/forests. Click on the Urban and Community Forestry tab at the top of the page, and then Roadside Tree Law in the menu on the left-hand side of the web page. Maryland Roadside Tree Care Expert Exam, Study Guide version 3.0, Chapter 6, Tree Problem Diagnosis.
Disease is an abnormal condition of an organism or part as a consequence of infection or environmental stress. It is the result of a pathogen. A pathogen is a causal agent of disease that can include insects, mites, nematodes, fungi, viruses, bacteria, and environmental stress. When diagnosing a tree problem, it is good to know the difference between symptoms and signs. Symptoms are changes in growth or appearance due to disease, insect, or injury, whether biotic or abiotic, that are apparent on a tree. The signs are direct indications or evidence of the causal agent, such as fruiting bodies, emergent holes, and frass. Patterns and timing of damage can indicate the possible cause. When diagnosing and treating plant disease, it is important to understand the plant disease triangle. Disease can only occur if these three things exist at the same time: a pathogen, a host, and a supporting environment. Manipulating a component or combinations of the triangle components influences the incidence and severity of the disease. Trees often decline or experience problems due to multiple factors, especially by the time you get called in to do an evaluation. Most likely there will be multiple factors. So problem diagnosis is more complex than simply looking for the first insect or disease you can find and then declaring that the problem's been identified. If a person has a cough, they may have a cold or they may have something more serious. A diagnosing physician would want to ask the patient about the problem they are experiencing. They would examine the patient's medical history. They would examine the patient's family medical history and perhaps perform certain standard diagnostic tests. A tree diagnostician should follow a similar pattern of research, observation, and testing to diagnose and recommend treatment for a tree. Proper steps in diagnosing include tree identification. What type of tree are you diagnosing? Sometimes the family history of a tree is very important, as certain pests are specific to certain species, genera, or families of plants. Look for something out of the ordinary. The book, The Body Language of Trees, tells us that trees grow in a very logical way, and if something looks unusual, it means that something might be wrong. Learning how to read these signs can help you understand what the tree is telling you about its condition. Trunk lean, decay fungi, root plate heaving, bulges on trunks, and spots on leaves all can indicate potential problems. Trees will tell you what the problem is if you look carefully and thoroughly at the entire tree, roots, stem, and crown. It is good to be systematic about the way you evaluate the tree, top to bottom or bottom to top, so that you don't miss any components. Examination of the site around the tree is important. Has there been trenching, ground disturbance, maybe some herbicide application, storm damage, or other factors that could affect tree health? Examine the site and any available site maintenance history. What is, quote-unquote, the medical history of a tree? This should provide some background on attending tree experts and arborists in the past that have performed certain treatments. You may be able to contact the prior practitioners, or the owner of the tree may have some history of previous treatments. Look for patterns of previous problems that have received treatments. Perform certain diagnostic tests as appropriate, perhaps a soil test, or sounding the tree with a rubber mallet, or doing more extensive diagnostic tests. There are helpful tools that help the tree expert evaluate changes in tree ring growth over time. These can include increment borers, resistographs, and drills, but keep in mind that these tools are invasive to the tree. Non-invasive tools are increasingly available and help evaluate the extent of internal decay without harming the tree. These include a rubber mallet, sonograms, and radar. They can detect the quantity and quality of remaining wood without disturbing the tree. Root collar excavations, whether performed by hand or with mechanical assistance, can reveal stem-girdling roots whether a tree was planted too deeply, or whether the burlap and twine or wire basket was removed at the time of planting. Here is a diagnostic flowchart that can help guide your tree evaluation. As we discussed previously, first identify the tree species. Then examine the tree itself. Be systematic about your evaluation. Look for conditions, cracks, bulges, decay, insects, diseases, and any other factor that may contribute to your diagnosis. Examine the site. What's the soil? What's the moisture availability? Was the tree planted too deeply? Was it mulched? Is there no mulch? Examine the maintenance history. What were previous treatments that were applied to the tree and why? Then perform diagnostic tests based on your evaluation. What is the soil that the tree is growing in? What is the pH? If you found evidence of pest, what is the identification of that pest? How much sound wood is available in the tree? And then based on all your findings, provide for an appropriate treatment. Injuries caused by ice, lightning, or pesticides are examples of impacts from abiotic or non-living factors. In urban areas, most tree failure occurs as a result or during storms. If a vertical strip of bark is missing from a point in the crown down to the ground with a rough groove that follows the grain of the wood, this is most likely a lightning strike. This photograph shows an old lightning strike on a Norway spruce trunk. Another abiotic factor that commonly impacts tree health are lawnmowers and weed whackers, as you can see from this damage at the base of this trunk. Diseases caused by bacteria, nematodes, or fungi are examples of impacts caused by biotic or living factors. Anthracnose is a name for a group of diseases caused by several closely related fungi that attack many shade trees. It is common on the foliage and twigs of ash, sycamore, such as in these photographs, maple, and white oak. The anthracnose fungi can also attack walnut, hickory, elm, birch, catalpa, linden, plane tree, tulip tree, and horse chestnut. Symptoms moving from the bottom of the tree upward are typical of anthracnose.
After a diagnosis like anthracnose, there are a few ways to prevent disease from infecting nearby trees. These methods of sanitation include pruning diseased branches and disposing of them off the property. To a landfill. Do not chip diseased branches and combine with other material if it will be later used as mulch or come in contact with healthy trees. Another type of sanitation is to rake and destroy affected leaves. Finally, removal of the infected tree from nearby healthy trees may be necessary.
Discula anthracnose, or dogwood anthracnose, is a serious disease which can kill flowering dogwood trees. It is caused by a fungus. Early in the spring, anthracnose fungi may kill twigs and newly expanding leaves, causing symptoms that resemble frost injury. Small sunken dead areas, otherwise known as cankers, can girdle the branches. Infections of the leaves or leaflets can cause dead blotches along leaf veins and sometimes some distortion. Infected leaves and leaflets may drop from the tree, causing defoliation. If the holes are in a uniform horizontal band around the trunk without any frass, these are most likely caused by sapsuckers. The photograph on the right, the large hole in the tree, is caused by a pileated woodpecker. Holes in the bark with visible frass may be caused by borers. Caterpillars, such as the gypsy moth caterpillar, cause damage to trees with their chewing mouthparts. Leaf miners also cause damage to trees based on chewing mouthparts, such as this locust leaf miner. Let's review some of the signs and symptoms and their possible causes that appear in this table in your study guide on page 3. Scales affect the plant with sucking mouthparts. These soft scales, such as elm scale and magnolia scale, produce honeydew, on which sooty mold fungi grows, so you may see sooty mold on leaves below the infested branches. Aphids are another insect that damage the plant by sucking. When you see white to gray-white fungi on your leaves and the shoots, this could be powdery mildew. When you note a canker, which is a localized area of stem where the bark is sunken or missing, this may be caused by a wound or disease. If you cut a twig sample and you see dark discolored streaks in the young xylem, this is most likely verticillium wilt, which is a vascular disease. If you see mushrooms or fruiting bodies, this indicates decay. Epicormic shoots indicate stress or a weakened plant. In this case, the abiotic factors of construction and over-pruning stress this tree. Necrosis is the dieback of tissue. It can be caused by stress, insects and disease, and environmental factors. If you see general chlorosis or lack of chlorophyll on the plant, which is the yellowing of a leaf or leaves, you would look for nutrient deficiencies, pollution perhaps, excess water, construction damage, insect problems, or diseases. Wilting of the leaves is a general symptom that can be caused by many different factors. That may include environmental stresses, drought or lack of water, of course, borers, verticillium wilt, canker disease, winter injury, construction damage, transplanting, anything that affects the vascular system of the tree. Defoliation is a loss of leaves. It can have a variety of causes as well. In this particular case, the viburnum leaf beetle completely defoliated this shrub. Spider mites are a close relative of insects. They also damage the plant by sucking. Spider mites cause a stippling or bronzing appearance on the foliage. Some clues that you find during your diagnosis may not mean anything. As an example, the exfoliation or peeling of the bark on a mature plane or sycamore tree is actually quite normal. However, peeling bark on a type of tree that doesn't have this pattern under normal conditions would be one of your clues you use during your assessment. Some plant pests travel on their own. Some are carried by vectors or carriers. Elm yellows and Dutch elm disease are both examples of diseases that are often transmitted by insect vectors. In this case, for Dutch elm disease, it is the elm bark beetle. Bacterial leaf scorch is a bacterium thought to be transmitted by plant hoppers. It affects a wide variety of shade trees. It first appears in the lower branches and on the older interior leaves. People are sometimes the vector of pest. Emerald ash borer, for example, was introduced into Maryland on infected nursery stock. Emerald ash borer attacks ash trees and leaves a small D-shaped exit hole on the tree. Asian longhorn beetle is an exotic pest native to eastern China and Korea. It is a very serious threat to our hardwood species. It has not yet been detected in Maryland. When collecting samples for the purpose of diagnosing plant problems, be sure to include the proper form for that plant disease lab and collect samples that include the transition zone between healthy and infected tissue. Tree experts are often requested to perform tree risk assessments. The need for risk assessment is normally based on the premise that personal injury or property damage could result if a certain tree part or tree failed. Because liability is possible, such assessment should be documented in writing. An external swelling or bulge is likely an indicator of internal decay or a cavity. An external rib on a tree is a likely indicator of an internal crack. Decay, which only affects the dead tissue in the center of the tree, is normally referred to as heart rot. Most experts agree that 30 to 35% loss of stem diameter due to heart rot requires that some action be taken to address the risk of whole tree failure. Mushrooms or fruiting bodies on a trunk or branch indicate a need for further assessment to determine whether or not internal decay is present. It is important to learn certain decay fungi, as they are most assuredly an indicator of rot. Brown rot are fungi that consume cellulose, resulting in wood that is stiff but brittle, like a hard biscuit, and subject to failure without warning. White rots are fungi that consume both the cellulose and lignin, resulting in soft, flaky, or stringy decay that is whitish to reddish brown in color.
You should consider all of these signs when assessing a tree. Although tree risk assessments are not covered in this class, the need for tree risk assessments is normally based on the premise that personal injury or property damage could result if a certain tree failed. Because liability is possible, such assessments should be documented in writing. People, structures, improvements, and vehicles are potential targets for hazardous trees. A hazard tree is defined as a tree with a defect and a target. An unsound tree in an area with no target is not a hazard. If a previously unimproved area becomes developed, there may be a corresponding change in the need for tree risk assessments. The photo on the left does show a target if this tree failed. The picture on the right also shows a target, as it's the trail next to the tree. So both of these would be considered hazardous trees if they had a defect, because they have a target. We hope you found this supplemental presentation to be helpful as you prepare for the Roadside Tree Care Expert exam. This concludes the study content on tree problem diagnosis. Please proceed to the next presentation. Welcome to this online course content that supports preparing to take the Maryland Roadside Tree Care Expert exam. This supplemental presentation to the study guide is intended to aid those individuals who are preparing to take the Maryland Roadside Tree Care Expert exam as required for permitting under the Maryland Roadside Tree Law. Anyone managing a tree care program for a municipal, county, or state agency must have a certification to supervise tree care work under a roadside tree permit issued by the Maryland Forest Service of the Maryland Department of Natural Resources. This presentation corresponds to the information in the online study guide. The text of the study guide, version 3.0, may be found at dnr.maryland.gov/forests. Click on the Urban and Community Forestry tab at the top of the page, and then Roadside Tree Law in the menu on the left-hand side of the web page. Maryland Roadside Tree Care Expert Exam Study Guide, version 3.0, Chapter 7, Tree Selection, Installation, and Establishment.
The most important part of tree selection is matching the tree with the site. You want to plant the right tree in the right place for the right reason and in the right way. Before conducting any tree care practice, it is important to first ask the question why. The answer to this question will often guide the steps taken in the tree care needed. When planning to select and install a tree, consider these three main areas. What are the site conditions and considerations? What tree or trees will you be planting, and what are the tree's needs? And what is the purpose of planting a tree or trees? Let's look at each of these a little more closely. One of the most important parts of tree selection is matching the tree with the site. If the site is underneath an overhead utility line, for instance, you want to plant a small-scale tree with a decurrent or rounded branching pattern. Other site considerations might include the adaptability of the tree to the site. Is it acclimated to plant in your area? What is the plant hardiness zone? Are the soils appropriate for that species or to even plant a tree? Is there sufficient space, not just for the tree when it's small, but for when it matures? Are there other trees nearby or other plants or turf that may impact the health of this tree? And what are your planting needs? Can the tree be watered? Can it be cared for? What are the tree's requirements? As far as size, how tall will it get? Is there sufficient space for it to grow to its intended height? How wide will the crown spread? Do not plant too close to a building, for instance, with a tree that has a wide crown. How much light does it need? Is there going to be sufficient sun, or in some cases, sufficient shade? Is water needed? Is it a drought-tolerant plant? Is it a moist-tolerant plant? Is there access to water if there's not enough rain? What colors do the leaves turn? Aesthetics might be your goal, and that could be a factor. What fruit does it produce? How often and how much? And does that complement the site or the goal of planting the tree? What space does it need? And that includes not only above ground, but below ground. What is the rooting habit of the tree? And is it hardy enough to survive the coldest weather predicted for that area? Starting your project with a clear objective or purpose is critical. Trees can provide certain services and products, and you need to select species that best meet your objective. Trees can provide shade, screening for wind and visual barriers, aesthetics such as fall foliage. They can provide fruits or nuts, or maybe you want to make sure you don't have fruits or nuts on the project site. Perhaps you want to increase your species diversity for tree health. Perhaps you're trying to meet a legal requirement and you need to make sure your tree selection meets the specifications of a legal requirement. Perhaps you're trying to aid in water quality or provide some architectural support to the site. There are many reasons that you may engage in a tree planting project, and be sure to be clear at the outset. Let's look a little more closely at the term plant hardiness. This refers to the ability of a plant to tolerate the coldest temperatures experienced in a particular area. And there are maps that you can check for the plant hardiness for that particular species. I just want to note in this map, you'll see that it's from 2006. We'll look at another date range on a hardiness map to show that this does change, so you need to make sure you're referencing the most current information. This hardiness zone map is from 2015. As you may recall from the previous slide, it was from 2006. In the previous map, most of western Maryland was in green color, and that would be hardiness zone 6. Just 9 years later, with the change in the map, you can see that most of Maryland is now in hardiness zone 7. So again, please make sure when you're selecting your plant stock that it is appropriate to the current hardiness zone. Another way to visually show the change in hardiness zones is this map that compares the hardiness zone for 1990 to 2015. You'll notice in the state of Maryland that most of the state has changed one full hardiness zone. All plant materials should conform to American National Standards Institute Z60.1 American Standards for Nursery Stock. Required general specifications include for bare root and field-grown stock. Specifications shall include plant size by height or caliber as appropriate to the plant type. For container-grown stock and box-grown stock, specifications shall include plant size by height or caliber as appropriate to the plant type and container class or box size. Trees are generally available from nurseries in one of three forms. Bare root, which are small, easy to plant, easy to ship, they're lightweight, they're field grown, and they cost less. Balled and burlap trees are dug in the nursery. They can lose up to 95% of their absorbing roots. They do cost more. They're heavier to move, and they come wrapped in burlap that you have to contend with on the planting site. Containerized trees come in a plastic or natural pot with a soil mix. Could include bark, compost, wood chips, as you see in this photograph, peat, or sand. For nursery stock that's less than 4 inches, the caliper is measured on the trunk at 6 inches above the ground. For nursery stock greater than 4 inches, caliper is measured at 12 inches above the ground. Before you accept any planting stock, the soil level at the top of the root ball or container should be examined in order to determine if the root collar is at the proper level. You can see in this photograph that the root flare is below the soil line in this pot. Trees with soil balls greater than 30 inches in diameter should be burlapped, followed by drum lacing with rope. Burlap should be biodegradable, but that's not always the case, and shall completely cover the root ball. Soil balls less than 18 inches usually do not have to be reinforced with cord or rope unless the soil happens to be sandy and the ball is apt to break apart. When planting a bare root tree, dig the hole 2 to 5 times bigger than the diameter of the stem at the root collar. The sides should be slanted and the depth the same or a little less than the root ball. The hole should then be domed in the middle and the tree set on the dome with the roots spread out around the dome. This should allow the roots loose soil to grow in. Do not expose roots to air as they will dry out quickly. Because the tree has a limited root system, it might need staking. Planting a tree with a taproot requires digging a hole deep enough to extend the root down straight beneath the stem. The hole should not be deeper than the extended taproot because the root collar will be covered by soil. Do not bend the taproot. When planting balled and burlap trees, remove the sod if present. Loosen the soil and remove it from the hole and slope the sides. Dig the hole a minimum of 1.5 times the diameter of the root ball, preferably 2 to 3 times the diameter of the root ball, not only to give yourself room to work, but also to loosen the soil for root development. Make the hole slightly less than as deep as the root ball. Make sure that there are no glazed sides in the hole. This is especially easy in clay soil, so you need to be mindful of that. Handle the tree carefully, not by the stem, so you avoid root breakage. If drainage is a problem, you can plant the root ball as much as 1/3 the height of the root ball above the grade of the soil. To eliminate settling in the bottom of the hole, it should remain undisturbed to give the root ball solid support. If you're planting a balled and burlap tree, cut the burlap and twine. Remove the burlap from the top and sides of the root ball. This allows the roots to grow out the top and sides of the root ball. Fold the burlap down to avoid wicking. Make sure it is below the soil line. Remove it completely if it is synthetic, not natural burlap. If your tree comes with a wire basket, remove the wire basket completely if possible, or cut away as much of the wire as possible if not. Backfill your hole with the same soil unless it is very poor soil. In most cases, amending the soil with organic material will not be of any particular benefit to the newly planted tree. Make sure there are no air pockets, tamp it down with your boot, and that the trunk is vertical. Firm up the soil and water the tree. One factor about planting trees that needs to be emphasized very clearly is not to plant your tree too deeply in the soil. That root flare at the bottom of your young tree needs to be at the soil grade or slightly higher. Do not plant your tree too deeply. Under normal conditions, root growth is best encouraged by planting the tree evenly with the surrounding ground. In wet conditions where drainage may be a problem, raising the root ball 1/3 above the ground will aid the spread of lateral roots. In arid or dry conditions, a basin can be created to use to collect water. A containerized tree may be root bound when delivered. Separate and cut the roots, especially any kinked or circling roots. This will encourage the roots to grow out into the soil instead of continuing to grow in a circle around the tree. Circling roots are common in trees which were started in containers. Kinked and circling roots could reduce the growth of the tree or eventually even kill it. Remove the container before planting unless it is biodegradable, which is not common. The container should not be removed by pulling or leveraging the trunk of the tree. Appropriate removal techniques may include bending, wiggling, and/or cutting the plastic container away. When is the best time to transplant trees? For deciduous trees, it is generally best to plant after leaf drop or abscission in the fall and before leaf out in the spring. If deciduous trees that have leafed out must be moved, the use of anti-transplants may be warranted to reduce the possibility that plants will reach the permanent wilting point before, during, or after the transplanting. For evergreen trees, it is earlier in the fall and later in the spring than for deciduous trees. However, time to transplant can be species-specific. Check first. When digging a tree for transport, a rule of thumb for the width of the root ball is a minimum of 10 inches for every 1 inch of trunk diameter. Make clean cuts and wrap with burlap if the root ball is greater than 18 inches. Balled and burlap trees with large soil balls should be drum-laced with rope for additional support. Extra care must be given to trees with large taproots as they are harder to transplant than systems with fibrous root systems. It is important when selecting your species and your site location that you anticipate the height and spread of the tree at maturity. That includes the trunk. Check the proximity of the tree's location to hardscape features and utilities. You might also need to check the shade tolerance of the tree compared to the amount of light available on the site. Very large trees can be dug and transplanted by a mechanical device known as a tree spade. When using a tree spade, no attempt should be made to move trees that exceed the size limitations of the machine being used. To stake or not to stake. Staking is not always necessary for a newly planted tree. Staked trees often have smaller caliber, less trunk taper, and are more susceptible to tipping after the stakes are removed. Stake if the site is windy, has sandy soils, if you're planting a taller tree with a large canopy, or if there's a lot of pedestrian or equipment traffic in the area. You may also want to use a stake to protect from vandalism or mower and weed whacker damage. If a single stake is used, place it on the upwind side. Trees greater than 4 inches in diameter often require guying. Trees are guyed with 3 or 4 wires anchored to the ground, as you see in the rightmost image on your screen. If installing trees over 8 inches in diameter, support the tree with 4 guy wire of 1/4 inch 7-strand cable, 3/8 inch lag hooks, turnbuckles, and deadmen. If using metal stakes, wooden stakes, or eye screws with turnbuckles as devices for staking and guying, check these several times a year to make sure the tree is not being girdled and that the system is still intact. Remove wires and tags to prevent girdling. Tree staking and wraps should not be left on for more than a year. If trunk wrap and staking materials are left on indefinitely, trunk girdling and constriction may occur, as you see in these photographs. To conclude the installation of your tree, be sure to properly mulch, add any tree protection devices that may be needed, such as the wire cages in this photograph, remove tags and nursery stakes, water if necessary, and ensure there will be an ongoing monitoring program to check on your trees. Mulches are materials placed on the soil surface around the tree trunk to reduce moisture evaporation and improve soil conditions. Other benefits include minimizing turf and weed competition, reducing soil erosion, improving soil aeration, moderating soil temperature, and protecting against mechanical damage from lawnmower and weed whackers. The mulch layer should not exceed 2 to 4 inches in depth and should not be placed against the trunk of the tree, as collar rot can occur. It should be a minimum of 3 feet in diameter around the tree and can be as large as you wish or can afford. Here is an all too common but improper way to mulch a tree. As you can see, it is too deep, it is almost 12 inches deep, and it is placed against the trunk of the tree. Immediately after planting or transplanting your tree, how should the young tree be pruned? According to ANSI standards, prune only dead or broken branches. If it is an evergreen, do not prune because there are no latent buds present. Do not prune the crown to balance with the remaining rootstock. The rate of recovery and reestablishment after planting and transplanting varies with tree species. The general rule of thumb for reestablishment in temperate climates is 1 year for each inch of caliper. As an example, a 2-inch caliper tree would take 2 years to reestablish.
We hope you found this supplemental presentation to be helpful as you prepare for the Roadside Tree Care Expert exam. This concludes the study content on tree selection, installation, and establishment. Please proceed to the next presentation. Welcome to this online course content that supports preparing to take the Maryland Roadside Tree Care Expert exam. This supplemental presentation to the study guide is intended to aid those individuals who are preparing to take the Maryland Roadside Tree Care Expert exam as required for permitting under the Maryland Roadside Tree Law. Anyone managing a tree care program for a municipal, county, or state agency must have a certification to supervise tree care work under a roadside tree permit issued by the Maryland Forest Service of the Maryland Department of Natural Resources. This presentation corresponds to the information in the online study guide. The text of the study guide, version 3.0, may be found at dnr.maryland.gov/forests. Click on the Urban and Community Forestry tab at the top of the page, and then Roadside Tree Law in the menu on the left-hand side of the web page. Maryland Roadside Tree Care Expert Exam, Study Guide version 3.0. Chapter 8, Safety Standards and Practices.
American National Standards Institute, ANSI Z133 standards, contain arboriculture safety requirements for pruning, repairing, maintaining, and removing trees, cutting brush, and for using equipment in such operations. All Maryland licensed tree experts shall comply with these safety standards while working in the state of Maryland. Each person, employee or otherwise, shall be responsible for his or her own safety and comply with the appropriate federal and state occupational safety and health standards and all rules, regulations, and orders which are applicable to his or her own action and content. Please note that Maryland has occupational safety and health standards for tree care and removal operations. Employers shall instruct their employees in the proper use, inspection, and maintenance of tools and equipment, including ropes and lines, and require that appropriate working practices be followed. A job briefing shall be performed by the qualified tree expert in charge before the start of each job. The briefing shall be communicated to all affected workers. Instruction shall be provided in the identification, preventive measures, and first aid treatment of common poisonous plants, stinging, biting insects, and other pests indigenous to the area in which the work will be performed. A first aid kit, adequately stocked and maintained, shall be provided by the employer. Tree experts and other workers shall be instructed in its use and specific location. Clothing and footwear appropriate to the known job hazard shall be approved by the employer and worn by the employees. Workers shall wear head protection that conforms to ANSI Z89.1. Class E helmets shall be worn when working in proximity to electrical conductors. Face and eye protection shall comply with ANSI Z87.1. Chainsaw-resistant leg protection shall be worn while operating a chainsaw during ground operations. When noise levels exceed acceptable standards as established by federal regulations, approved hearing protection shall be provided by the employer and worn. Effective means of controlling pedestrian and vehicular traffic shall be instituted on every job site where necessary in accordance with U.S. Department of Transportation Manual on Uniform Traffic Control Devices or any applicable state and local laws and regulations.
A roadside tree care expert should take immediate action if a tree is leaning with recent root exposure, soil movement, or soil mounding near the base of the tree. Immediate action is also needed if more than half of the roots under the tree's crown have been cut or crushed, or if there is advanced decay present in the root flares, which are also called buttress roots. Dead branches of sufficient size to cause injury should be removed immediately. All of these conditions cause a hazardous situation. A tree is considered hazardous if it has the potential to fail and there is a target it may strike. Before working in a tree, always look for dead or broken branches, signs of decay, cables, bracing or guying wires, and electrical conductors, and utility lines. All overhead and underground electrical conductors and all communication wires and cables shall be considered to be energized with potentially fatal voltages. Electrical shock may occur during a ground fault simply by standing near the grounding object. Only qualified line clearance tree experts or qualified line clearance tree expert trainees shall be assigned to work where an electrical hazard exists. Qualified line clearance tree expert trainees shall be under the direct supervision of qualified line clearance tree experts. An electrical hazard exists when a worker, tool, tree, or any other conductive object is closer than 10 feet from an energized electrical conductor rated 50 kV phase-to-phase or less. Direct contact is made when any part of the body contacts an energized line.
Indirect contact occurs when any part of the body touches a conductive object that is in contact with an energized line. As you see in this graphic, the tree branch is in contact with the energized line. Conductive objects include a saw, tree branch, or another person. Even in an insulated bucket truck, indirect contact can be made. If a bucket truck is in contact with a conductor, then consider the truck to be energized. Do not simultaneously contact the truck and the ground around the truck. If a rescue is needed and the bucket cannot be lowered, then an aerial rescue by climbing may be needed. In this case, climbing spurs may be used. Footwear, including linemen's overshoes, having electrical resistant soles, shall not be considered as providing any measure of safety from electrical hazards. Rubber gloves, with or without leather or other protective covering, shall not be considered as providing any measure of safety from electrical hazards. Certainly, we've had a number of historic storms recently that involve interaction between trees and electrical hazards. Qualified line clearance tree experts and qualified line clearance tree expert trainees performing line clearance in the aftermath of these storms or under similar circumstances shall be trained in the special hazards associated with this type of work. Aerial devices shall be provided with a point of attachment to secure a full body harness with a shock-absorbing lanyard or body belt and lanyard. Fall protection shall be worn when working aloft.
Aerial devices shall not be used as cranes or hoists to lift or lower materials, unless specifically designed by the manufacturer to perform such operations. Wheel chocks shall be set before using an aerial device, unless the device has no wheels on the ground or is designed for use without chocks. No part of the boom or bucket shall make contact with energized electrical conductors, poles, trees, or similar objects.
Brush chippers equipped with a mechanical infeed system shall have a quick stop and reversing device on the infeed system, which shall be close to the end of the infeed hopper, located across the top and along each side of the infeed hopper, and be within easy reach of the worker. Vision, hearing, and other appropriate personal protective equipment shall be worn when in the immediate area of a brush chipper in accordance with ANSI Z133.1 standards. Brush chippers, trailer chippers, and towable stump cutters or stump cutter trailers, when detached from the vehicle, shall be chalked or otherwise secured in place. ANSI Z133.1 standards requires that when a chainsaw is being started, it shall be held firmly in place on the ground or otherwise supported in a manner that minimizes the movement of the saw when the starter handle is pulled. The chainsaw shall be started with the chain brake engaged. Drop starting a chainsaw is prohibited. Chainsaw safety devices may not be removed or modified and shall be operational. The kickback zone of a chainsaw is the front upper quadrant. Kickback happens while, in making a cut, the top of the bar nose contacts a solid object or is pinched. This causes the guide bar to fly back toward you. Kickback occurs at a rate twice as fast as a human can react. The direction of safe retreat when felling a tree is 45 degrees from the sides and back on either side. Never move away directly behind the tree, as you can be seriously hurt if the tree butt kicks back during the fall. Using a bore cut and a release cut will make it easier to retreat in plenty of time. Don't turn your back on a falling tree. Walk quickly away to a distance of 20 feet or more from the falling tree and position yourself behind a standing tree if possible. When manually felling trees, notches and back cuts shall be made at a height that enables the chainsaw operator to safely begin the cut, control the tree or trunk, and have freedom of movement toward a retreat or escape route. The notch cut used shall be a conventional notch, an open-faced notch, or a Humboldt notch. Notches shall be used for felling all trees over 5 inches diameter at breast height. When performing the tree removal, the notch depth should not exceed 1/3 the diameter of the tree. When limbing and bucking, the tree expert must stand on the uphill side of the work. Whenever possible, cut limbs on the opposite side of the tree trunk from which you are working. Doing so keeps the tree trunk between you and the saw. Wedges should be used as necessary to prevent binding of the guide bar or chain when bucking up trunks of trees.
We hope you found this supplemental presentation to be helpful as you prepare for the Roadside Tree Care Expert exam. This concludes the study content on safety standards and practices. Please proceed to the next presentation. Welcome to this online course content that supports preparing to take the Maryland Roadside Tree Care Expert exam. This supplemental presentation to the study guide is intended to aid those individuals who are preparing to take the Maryland Roadside Tree Care Expert exam as required for permitting under the Maryland Roadside Tree Law. Anyone managing a tree care program for a municipal, county, or state agency must have a certification to supervise tree care work under a roadside tree permit issued by the Maryland Forest Service of the Maryland Department of Natural Resources. This presentation corresponds to the information in the online study guide. The text of the study guide, version 3.0, may be found at dnr.maryland.gov/forests. Click on the Urban and Community Forestry tab at the top of the page, and then Roadside Tree Law in the menu on the left-hand side of the web page. Maryland Roadside Tree Care Expert Exam Study Guide, version 3.0, Chapter 9, Construction and Trees. Construction damage is one of the most common causes of tree death and decline in urban areas. Tree damage on construction sites can occur from soil compaction, root removal caused by changes in soil grade, branches that may be broken, tree trunks that may be damaged, and by incorrect pruning by untrained personnel. The two most important factors to protect trees from construction activity are soil compaction and root removal from grade changes. Roots extend much further than the drip line of a tree and will be found mostly in the upper few inches, 12 to 18 inches, of the soil. Most of a tree's absorbing roots are in the upper 12 inches of soil to be able to use oxygen and water. When soil is compacted by construction activities, the pore space between the soil particles is greatly reduced. This reduces the ability of roots to absorb oxygen, water, and minerals, and reduces the ability of roots to grow and expand because they cannot penetrate into the soil.
When grade is lowered during construction activity, it is referred to as a cut. Changes in grade can result in the loss of root volume, the aeration in the soil is affected, and drainage patterns are changed. If the grade is raised, it is referred to as fill, and this may suffocate the roots. As little as 4 inches of grade change can kill some species. In this particular instance, the grade was changed around this large specimen tree by more than 5 feet. Tree walls and retaining walls are scheduled for installation during the construction process to allow tree retention when changes in grade are required. The graphic on the left is for a tree well that is used when the grade is raised using fill. The graphic on the right is a retaining wall that is used when the grade is lowered with a cut. Tree wells and retaining walls are only useful if properly installed. This tree well is definitely too close to the trunk of this red oak. According to ANSI standards, if fill must be placed within the critical root zone of the tree well should be at least 24 inches away from the trunk flare. It is commonly thought that a healthy tree can tolerate removal of approximately 1/3 of its total root mass. Trenching can severely injure a tree. Instead, auger under the roots. Tunneling may also be used instead of trenching to minimize impact to a tree's critical root zone. Minimum depth should be 24 inches, so below the root plate, to avoid damage to any taproots that may be present. Pruning roots prior to construction can help avoid impacts to the critical root zone. Roots should be cleanly cut using a vibratory knife or other acceptable equipment. Backfill the trench with soil to minimize drying of the roots. Here is an example of how trenching can severely damage a tree. Here, a trench was put in place within the critical root zone of the tree in the back of the photograph, and the roots were not cleanly cut, but cut, quote unquote, with the backhoe.
Aeration can help soils that have been compacted or where grade has been raised 6 inches or less. The aeration holes are sometimes filled with peat moss, sand, vermiculite, or pea gravel. This treatment must be on a regular basis and is not a one-shot treatment.
If few to no roots over 1 inch in diameter will be impacted by construction activity, the tree will probably tolerate the impact. Most healthy trees are able to tolerate removal of possibly up to 1/2 of their absorbing roots, not the structural roots, without serious effect. According to ANSI A300, tree protection devices such as fencing, berms, and signage can be installed prior to site work to limit access to the critical root zone. The tree or trees will show signs and symptoms if construction damage has occurred. These can include slow rates of growth in the crown. You may see some dieback, especially at the upper tips. On leaves, you can see that they may be wilted, scorched, undersized. Maybe the autumn color shows up prematurely, out of season. They prematurely drop their leaves. The trunk, you may see actual wounds where the bark is removed. You may see adventitious sprouting or suckering, or insect damage and disease that might be more severe than normal. You can see on the branches that the growth rate has slowed. There may be actual wounds. Again, you may see sprouting and suckering there as well. And fruits and flowers. You may see an abnormally large crop of fruit, and it may be flowering out of season. Here's an example of some tip dieback in the crown of this large white oak tree as a result of soil compaction from a construction project. Keep in mind that certain symptoms may not show up in the tree until into the future. If trees are damaged during construction, then what? In the event of damage to either the tree protection zone barriers, of course that should be corrected right away, or trees within them, corrective measures should be specified and implemented. For the trees themselves that are damaged, as soon as treatment can begin, after the damage, the better. If a significant portion of the root system is destroyed, then the remaining root system should be pampered, and perhaps the tree should be evaluated if it's even still able to be retained. Mulch is good to apply to hold soil moisture, moderate temperature extremes, and remove any competition from other plants around the tree. Regular irrigation is really effective because trees that don't become moisture stressed have a better chance at survival. Doing anything that maintains the tree vitality to avoid stress and infestation of insects and diseases, of course, is desirable. If fertilizer is needed, use a slow release form during the recovery period of the tree.
Prevention is the best way to minimize damage to trees during construction. Assess the site before construction and decide which trees to save before construction begins. Then write construction specifications to protect them. Place construction fences around trees to be saved. The minimum distance to place the protective devices would be at the drip line, the outer edge of the crown at ground level, or the dotted ring in the graphic. If possible, the ideal distance would be the critical root zone, or the teal ring in the graphic. The critical root zone is 1.5 foot radius for every inch diameter of the tree measured at 4.5 feet above the ground, also known as diameter at breast height, or DBH.
Here's an example of calculating the critical root zone of a specimen tree. The critical root zone for a specimen tree is 1.5 foot radius for every inch diameter of the tree. In this example, this 30-inch diameter tree has a critical root zone radius of 45 feet. Keep in mind that the critical root zone radius may extend beyond the drip line of the tree. Trees scheduled for retention should not be damaged during tree removal during the pre-construction phase. Tree protection zone barriers shall be installed prior to site clearing, grading, and demolition, and maintained throughout the construction process. Specifications for barriers should include, but are not limited to, the types of fencing, use of barriers, for example signs, manner of installation, and conditions of encroachment into the critical root zone.
The single most important element to protect trees from construction damage is highly visible tree protective fencing that can help remind workers to stay away from the tree protection zones, especially while operating heavy equipment.
For temporary access over a tree's root zone, you can use vertical mulching and then place 6 to 12 inches of mulch to disperse the weight of any equipment. When construction is finished, half of the depth of the mulch can be removed and spread out over the area under the drip line.
A tree's ability to tolerate impacts from construction depend on its age, health, and vigor. Some defensive dieback will occur when root loss is significant. Expect this to begin 1 to 2 years after construction. Even mature trees can experience significant dieback. This tree's dieback of branches in the canopy is the direct result of trenching to install utility lines. This picture was taken 15 months after the trenching occurred. Treatment of construction damaged trees is an ongoing process and should be continued over the life of the tree. In conclusion, have good pre-construction planning, keep equipment and personnel out of critical root zones, use sharp tools for root pruning if needed, minimize grade changes around trees to be saved, and use proper mitigation techniques if disturbance cannot be avoided. If you keep these things in mind, you have a better chance of saving trees during construction. We hope you found this supplemental presentation to be helpful as you prepare for the Roadside Tree Care Expert exam. This concludes the study content on construction and trees. Please proceed to the next presentation. Welcome to this online course content that supports preparing to take the Maryland Roadside Tree Care Expert exam. This supplemental presentation to the study guide is intended to aid those individuals who are preparing to take the Maryland Roadside Tree Care Expert exam as required for permitting under the Maryland Roadside Tree Law. Anyone managing a tree care program for a municipal, county, or state agency must have a certification to supervise tree care work under a roadside tree permit issued by the Maryland Forest Service of the Maryland Department of Natural Resources. This presentation corresponds to the information in the online study guide. The text of the study guide, version 3.0, may be found at dnr.maryland.gov/forests. Click on the Urban and Community Forestry tab at the top of the page, and then Roadside Tree Law in the menu on the left-hand side of the web page. Maryland Roadside Tree Care Expert Exam, Study Guide version 3.0. Chapter 10, Tree Identification. The tree identification portion of the test shall consist of the identification of 20 trees using photographs. All questions will be multiple choice. The questions will be chosen from this list. This list can be found in the Study Guide 3.0 on page 45.
As with the other modules in the Tree Expert Exam Study Guide, version 5.1, it is important to first ask the question why before providing tree care. In this module, why do we need to accurately identify the plant species that will be involved in our tree care? Because knowing the exact tree species that we're dealing with can greatly influence the type and extent of tree care that we provide. When identifying tree species, it is important to understand the value of proper nomenclature, the scientific species name versus common names. Why is this important? As you can see from the photographs on this slide that are for Carpinus carolinea, this tree is also commonly known as American hornbeam, blue beech, musselwood, and ironwood. If we were to go to a nursery and ask for ironwood, we may not get this exact genus and species. When examining a tree for identification, it is important to use multiple characteristics to confirm our identification. These could include the range of the species, the overall shape of the tree, the bark may have a particular feature, the twig arrangement. The leaves may be very unique, the fruits, and the flowers. Let's look a little more closely at each of these characteristics. The natural range of a species is the area upon which it normally grows. Now, of course, we know that tree species have been planted outside of their range by humans. So this may or may not help you identify a particular tree species, especially in a garden situation or an urban setting. What is the overall tree shape? This tree is columnar in shape and is an eastern red cedar. This tree is considered to be vase-shaped and is an American elm. Bark may be another helpful feature to identify a tree. When evaluating the bark, look at such features as the color, fissures, furrows, and thickness. The tree in the photo is sycamore or Platanus occidentalis. The bark in this photograph belongs to river birch. It can be confused with black cherry, so again, it is important to use multiple features to confirm the identification of the tree species. Twig arrangement on the branch can be a very useful feature to at least narrow down the tree identification. In this case, the acronym MADCAP horse, standing for maple, ash, dogwood, caprifoliaceae, which are your honeysuckles and viburnums, and horse chestnuts all have opposite twig arrangement. What are other features of the twigs other than arrangement that we can use for tree identification? What is the color of the twig? Is there a scent? If you break it or cut it open, is there some particular scent? What are the bud scars? In this photograph, this is an ash twig, and the bud scars can certainly be indicative of what species of ash it is. What is the pith? If you cut a twig vertically, what does the pith look like? Size and width. Again, this is an ash twig. These are very stout looking twigs. That's indicative of the species. And what are the bud arrangements? As we discussed previously, ash trees have opposite twig arrangement. They also have opposite bud arrangement. The buds on the twigs can be another feature that you can use to identify trees. Terminal buds are on the end of the twig, as we've learned in the biology module. The marks inside a leaf scar are called bundle scars. On this white ash, you can see the vascular bundles in the leaf scar. This particular formation for ash, some people remember as a happy smile. Here are examples of three very distinct end buds. The photograph on the left, American beech, has a very cigar-shaped end bud. The photograph in the middle is white oak. It has multiple end buds. And the photograph on the right is yellow poplar. Leaves are probably the most common feature of a tree used to identify the species. Of course, they are not always available, but most guides are based on leaf identification. When you use the leaves to identify a tree, you can look at these different features of the leaf: the arrangement on the stem, the size, the color, the scent. This photograph is a sassafras leaf, and when you crush it, it has a very distinct scent. Morphology or shape. Certainly the sassafras leaf, also known as the mitten tree, has very distinct leaf morphology. The density of the leaves. Imagine thinking of a Norway maple that has a very high density tree crown. Are the leaves simple or compound? And what is the veination or vein pattern in the leaf? Since leaves are commonly used to identify plants, let's go over some of the terminology used to describe the anatomy of a leaf. The entire leaf surface, the green part of the leaf, is called the blade. The leaf itself is the blade plus the petiole. The petiole is the stem that attaches the leaf blade to the twig. The midrib is the portion of the leaf that runs down the center of the leaf blade. The bud sits between the base of the petiole and the twig. If your leaf is a compound leaf, then there are a couple other terms to know. This entire surface is the leaf, from the base of the petiole to the tip of the last leaflet. This is a compound leaf. Leaf arrangement on the stem can either be alternate, opposite, or whorled. Here are two examples of a simple versus a compound leaf. The photograph on the left is an elm, while the photograph on the right is a black walnut. Leaves can come in a variety of shapes, including, as an example, triangular, this is a cottonwood, oval for serviceberry, elliptical for your elms, and this unique shape for the yellow poplar or tulip poplar. People think it looks like a tulip. Leaf margins can also be a helpful feature for identification. The margins are the edges, outside edges of the leaves, which have very different patterns. The photograph on the left is black cherry, which has a serrated edge. The photograph in the middle is white oak, which has a lobed edge. And the photograph in the right is dogwood, which has an entire edge or smooth edge. Although not always available to us to identify a tree species, fruits can be very helpful. They come in forms such as acorns, nuts, cones, samaras or wing seed, drupes, legumes, berries, and palms. Let's look at each of these in a little more detail. A drupe is a fruit that has a fleshy exterior with a large pit inside. You can think of your cherries, peaches, plums, and apricots. Acorns are a type of dry fruit composed of a nut with a cap of fused bracts. This, of course, you think of oaks. Samaras are a dried fruit composed of a seed with a papery wing that helps with seed distribution, such as your maples, your ash, and your elm. A palm is a multi-celled, multi-seeded fleshy fruit, like your pears and apples. A legume consists of a long pod containing large seeds lined up one by one. Most common species you may encounter are honey locust and black locust. A nut is a large, dry, one-seeded fruit with a thick, hard wall or husk. These are your hickories and walnuts. And your cones. These are seed-bearing structures of the conifer trees, consisting of a central stem, woody or fleshy scales, bracts, and seeds. These are your pine, spruce, fir, hemlock, and your junipers. Here's an example of two different fruits. The one on the left is a crabapple. The one on the right, a samara, is the wing seed of a sugar maple. Flowers are another feature we can use for tree identification. The different parts of the flower that we can use are the arrangement on the stem. In this photograph, the flowers are opposite. The size of the flower. Some can be quite large, others very almost inconspicuous. The color of the flower, again in this photograph, this has a slightly red hue to the flower. And the scent, sometimes that can be very distinct as well. The photograph is of the flowers of a red maple. There are certain species in Maryland to be aware of that are of concern because they are extremely invasive. These are Norway maple, Bradford pear, ailanthus or tree of heaven, white mulberry, paulownia, and common or glossy buckthorn. This is Ailanthus altissima. It is commonly seen in disturbed sites in our urban areas, perhaps in farm fields and along our highways. This, of course, is Bradford pear, another extremely invasive plant species in Maryland. There are certain tree identifications aids that might be helpful for you to obtain if you haven't already. Of course, there are a wide variety of books and field guides and a number of websites, including the Virginia Tech Dendrology site. There are a number of apps that you can download on your smartphone, And of course, you can always go to nurseries and arboretums as a way to train your tree ID skills. Sometimes you can find local and online courses that can help you expand your tree identification skills. And sometimes the best way to go is to go with a field leader that is very skilled in tree identification. Here are some of the tree identification aids, the books that are commonly used. Of course, Peterson Guide, National Audubon, and Sibley are very common field guides that are used. Here's a number of websites that might be helpful to you. We already mentioned the Virginia Tech online website. Another one that has very useful information are Arboretum sites such as the Morton Arboretum, and the National Arbor Day Foundation has their What Tree Is That online leaf key. Some really great apps are coming out that you can use for tree identification. Leaf Snap is very popular. A new one by iNaturalist called Seek uses your smartphone technology. You hold your camera phone up to the plant and it'll give you possible identification matches. And of course, Virginia Tech, we already mentioned their dendrology website, also has an app called vTree. When you identify trees, be sure to use all of your senses. Your sight, your smell, your taste, of course, do that judiciously. Touch, also do this judiciously. Some plants have an irritant in them. Sound, certain trees do make certain specific sounds, like quaking aspen and whispering sound of pine trees. And use your common sense.
We hope you found this supplemental presentation to be helpful as you prepare for the Roadside Tree Care Expert exam. This concludes the study content on tree identification and is the last presentation.